My name is Desmond and I'm the Chief Executive of the Galleries of Justice Museum and the National Centre for Citizenship in the Law, based in Nottingham. We're based at the old Shire Hall building and we're a museum of crime and punishment. Around 2 years ago I was asked to write an article for a new book called Learning to Live by IPPR, and the idea was that we'd look at different styles of learning within the museum sector and the value that they brought to society. The concept I had was called Republic of Museums, and it was my thinking really that whilst we had Renaissance in the regions, there wasn't a great feeling of fraternity amongst museums, and it was very much a funding model. And the thinking was that there was a huge amount of money put into Renaissance, but how much did society as a whole know about Renaissance, and how much of it was a political lobbying aspect for museums? Well, I think in some ways, although Renaissance did a fantastic job in terms of museum education, we didn't translate that effectively. So when it came to a new coalition government and government cuts, I'm not sure how well museums are going to do as part of that. We know that MLA is being absorbed into the Arts Council, and we know that a number of local authority museums are under threat of cuts. Far more, I think, than our Arts Council cousins, which is around 15%, whereas a lot of museums are facing 30% cuts. The Republic of Museums, I mean, it comes from the term Republic of Literature, and the thinking is that actually you build a fraternity of museums working together. This seems to work because we have a number of museums which have all got their financial bases, and they've also all got intellectual bases and collections and everything else, but we're all acting relatively independently. So you've got a lot of resources being used, but if you're cutting funding, then they are all going to shrink. The idea is hopefully a radical one, that we actually re-look at partnership within museums, but we do that without a funding base. I think in the past that funding has very much created partnerships, and we've quite often got into partnership relationships purely on terms of funding, and therefore they've lacked sustainability. But for the Republic of Museums, the idea is for us to have real partnerships where we share resources, but we also strengthen ourselves as museums by working together. So general society understands that museums are a force to be reckoned with. The starting point, or principle one, is that history should be used as a medium of change. One of the frustrations of museums is that our society doesn't seem to learn from the past, and museums are a fantastic resource for that. We're not simply a place where you come and you learn about the past, and that is the part of the learning. The learning has got to translate into some degree of cultural and social change. So the Republic of Museums wants museums to be placed at a different level within society. As we see each government coming in and making the same mistakes, if we see countries still going to war and those wars being looked at retrospectively, what a fantastic opportunity to look at museums as a resource that can remind society of the successes of the past, but also the mistakes of the past. So as I said, principle one is using history as a medium of social change, particularly as our audiences are a lot made up of young people. So we have a real opportunity, in fact we have a responsibility to teach those young people about society so that they can shape future society. Principle two of Republic of Museums is to collect ideas from outside the sector, then adapt and display. By nature, museums are conservative, and I think that's partly their downfall in terms of funding, and I'm using conservative with a small c, because they are very respectful and their role is conservation. Sometimes they don't think beyond the sector, whereas other sectors are far more flexible. Increasingly, my view is that we need to bring people from outside the sector into the sector so they can understand the benefits of museums. For example, at the Galleries of Justice Museum, we have a commercial manager now who has gone on to become head of museum, who comes from a banking background. So she built a lot of relationships within the financial sector, and she's now putting that thinking into a museum. As a result, we've had the highest visitor numbers in the last 5 years, and our spend per head has increased. Also, we have now a lot of corporate partners. It may seem a bit absurd, a banker coming into the museum sector, but there are some real strengths that they can utilise within our sector. Plus it gives us a status now when we work with other partners. You can collect ideas right across the board, and I think increasingly our partners come from education backgrounds, they come from social welfare backgrounds, as opposed to purely within the museums. MLA seems to be relatively isolated in many ways and is disappearing. There are a number of reasons for that, but by being isolated you are under threat. So the more partners that you can get, the more ideas that you can share across different sectors, the better. Museums do a lot of different functions, so therefore we need people that aren't simply from a heritage background. We need educationists, we need commercial managers, you need fundraisers, and you need people from sales backgrounds and financial backgrounds. So there's quite a lot of skills there that can be transferable. But I think the underlying one of that is selling our message so that it is fully understood. Principle 3 is why not be radical? I'd like the Republic of Museums to become champions of liberty, equality and citizenship learning. We have to act as a moral compass to society. We can do that by presenting those 3 themes. Citizenship, by understanding that we're a resource for society that they can utilise. A social resource in communities. Museums are all in communities that can be used by the local people. Libraries are under a difficult circumstance at the moment, but they are a fantastic community resource. Could we work with libraries by having libraries within museums or part of their collection? In terms of liberty, museums offer on the whole free access, but certainly they are very accessible. And therefore, in terms of liberty, you can really teach people about liberty and the history of a country's liberty. Equality, we have a level playing field. We've done a lot of very good work in terms of positive action schemes to get every member of society into the museum sector. And I think we have to have that equality and enable people to, as I say, access us. Are we champions? Well, I'm not sure if we are champions at the moment, but we certainly need to be champions in society going forward. Level 4 is do whatever it takes to survive. We are unfortunately in survival mode, a lot of us, so that's why we need partnership. Museums have to work together now to survive. One of the principles I'm going to be talking about shortly is this whole idea of sharing resources. But certainly we need to look around us and form common threads between museums. We can't go into these cuts individually. We have to lobby councils and government, and we can only do that from a position of strength, and that is working together. Principle 5 is very much about creating a Republic of Museums by strength in numbers, and I mean by that partnerships. They can't be false partnerships, i.e. in terms of funding or renaissance in terms of museum clusters. They have to be, I think, regional groups, so we all work together within our regions to represent ourselves as clusters of museums. And that has to be a level playing field, so it can't be led by national museums or voluntary museums or private museums. I think we need to think very much about political strength there and forming that structure that works best for us. As part of that partnership, we can share, as I said before, resources. The final point I want to make, and it's the chief output of Republic of Museums, is education syndicates. Now, museums have been at the forefront, I think, of voluntary sector education in recent years. We've invested an awful lot of money, and we've had some outstanding results of accessing young people, and indeed society as a whole, to education. The thinking behind education syndicates is that instead of having an individual education department within your museum, you share education departments. So for example, one of the projects we're working with is in London, and it's working with non-museums. So you've got the Galleries of Justice Museum and the NCCL, which is a National Centre for Citizenship, which is our education provider. The NCCL will be working with the Royal Courts of Justice and the Supreme Court, which are both working courtrooms in London, to deliver educational services to young people about the justice system. So effectively you've got one education provision, the NCCL, working with the Galleries of Justice Museum, a museum of crime and punishment, 2, the Royal Courts of Justice, a working court, and 3, the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land. Teaching young people to access all those buildings to learn about citizenship, the law and the justice system. In terms of the cost of that, you have one central cost, which is an administration at the NCCL, and facilitators and curriculum writers who create resources and then deliver them across the 3 museums. There's nothing to stop you having an education syndicate for a range of different museums. Yes, you'll need to offer bespoke activities at the different museums, but the central curriculum could be the same, i.e. museum education. So for 3 or 4 museums you could have a cluster of education coordinators, but with one administrative base. And the idea is that you'll have education syndicates across the country that will be very well resourced, standardised in terms of the curriculum, and then in terms of the economies of scale will be very cost effective. They will then create education packages for regionally 3 or 4 museums within their area, and they'll roll those out. How does that help? Well, one, it is the economies of scale, the cost centre is less. It can replace those education departments which have been dwindling or disappearing in that museum, or that museum hasn't got an education department. It will raise the status of those collections and those museums by providing a service for them. And then the other part of it is schools will easily understand the education syndicate. So instead of having 100 leaflets from all different museums, they'll have one central leaflet about education provision, and then you'll be able to, from your menu, decide on where you want to go for that education provision. It'll be standardised in terms of national curriculum, and it will tick the boxes in terms of local authority teaching. And then it will also be a force to be reckoned with the local authority, as they will see it as a museum education operation. This can also work, as I said, with non-museums. It can work with art galleries, it can work with public buildings. One of the other projects that the NCCL is going to be working with is Speakers Corner Trust. Not a museum, it's more of a campaign, but we're using museum education, i.e. based on history, to work with Speakers Corner Trust in terms of delivering resources for them. So, in summary, it's about creating a republic of museums so that museums work together in partnership as an agent for social change. And one of the chief outputs of that is education syndicates, where they deliver education across a cluster of museums. Finally, that can be also transferred to commercial activity, so that, for example, you have museum cafes that are run by a museum cafe syndicate who will then have cafes in a number of different museums, or curatorial syndicates where you have a group of curators that work across a number of different sites and service those sites. So it's a way of us sharing our resources in these difficult times, but also raising the status of museums, because we've done a fantastic lot of very good work over the last few years. It's now a point of reordering them, but also celebrating them and selling them as a commercial activity.